Good afternoon and welcome to this Chemistry World webinar. As you can see, I'm joined by our BSL interpreter today, Rachel Dance. The way that GoToWebinar works means that you can move that camera around so you can put her screen wherever you need it. So make her bigger, make her smaller, whatever it is that works for you. We're delighted that she could join us. She's from Cambridgeshire Deaf Association and has been working with us throughout this series of webinars to try and make them that little bit more inclusive. Now, this series of webinars is about building a better chemistry culture, and this is actually the fourth in the series, and we're looking at bullying and harassment in the chemical sciences. That includes the context of changing work environments due to the COVID-19 crisis, which is still going on. Now, a couple of reports from my colleagues at the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Breaking the Barriers and Exploring the Workplace for LGBT plus Physical Scientists reports provided evidence of bullying and harassment in the chemical sciences community and a systemic failure of the sector to deal with these issues effectively. That, of course, may then lead to a loss of talent as the sector becomes a little bit too unpleasant to work in for some people who are subject to bullying and harassment. So we wanted to include that as part of this series on building a better chemistry culture. And we wanted to discuss it with our guests today, but also to get your understanding of it, to understand your experience and what you think may be the best way for us to take the chemistry culture forward in terms of reducing and eradicating bullying and harassment. So today we're going to look at what bullying and harassing behaviours look like in a professional context. We'll explore the impact that bullying and harassment can have on individuals and on their careers. We'll look at the difficulties that people face in struggling to talk to friends and colleagues about their experiences. And we'll also see how institutions can enact mechanisms to bring about positive culture and behavioural change. So we have three guests today, and then we're going to go to your questions. We also want to hear from you in terms of our polls, so we get a good idea of who you are, what your level of understanding is, so we really know how we can best reach you and solve the problems that you have. So before we get into our guests, I'm going to introduce GoToWebinar, and then we're going to do the first bit of interaction with you as we go for a poll. So GoToWebinar is the software that we've chosen to use to allow you to interact with our speakers. The most important bit that you need to know is that there is a box down at the bottom where you can ask questions of the audience. Now let's have a look and see. There's usually one or two questions straight out of the gate. We have heard from, yes, of course, we've already got one from Digambar. So that's how you ask questions. We'll put those questions to our speakers at the end of the webinar, but you can ask questions at any point throughout the webinar. So just pop them in the box at the bottom there, and that should be all we need to get your questions to our audience. Now, before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to do our first poll, and this is just a sort of baseline for us to understand how you describe your understanding of bullying and harassment. And it's a very simple question. Would you say your understanding is very good? Is it good? Is it neither good nor poor? Is it poor, or is it very poor? And I'm going to launch that poll, and then I will stay silent for a second because obviously we won't see Rachel while you're filling in the poll. So please give us your answers and I'll pop back to you very soon. Thank you very much. We're going to use those results as a baseline, but I can tell you now that most of you, 46% of you, believe your understanding of these issues to be good, but only 9% say very good. I'm pleased to say that only 1% of you say your understanding of these issues are very poor. So that's a good place for us to start from. But over the course of the next hour or so, we'll have three excellent expert speakers who will help you to increase your understanding, and then an opportunity for you to ask some further questions. So who are those expert speakers? Well, first of all, we'll have Kevin Coutinho, who is a gender policy manager at the University College London. Now, he's an equalities practitioner within higher education, currently working at UCL as their Athena Swan Gender Equality Policy Manager, as you can see on the screen at the moment. After him, we will have David Richardson, who's Vice-Chancellor at the University of East Anglia, and then Carol Mundell, and I'll tell you more about them later on. Carol, Professor of Extragalactic Astronomy, not a chemist, but very much in the physical sciences, and Head of Astrophysics at the University of Bath. She's also Chief Scientific Advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Now, I have to say that we're particularly lucky to have all three of our guests with us today, but David in particular, because of what's going on in the UK. It's A-level results day in the UK at the moment. Those are the results that normally decide your progress to university or not. So David, being Vice-Chancellor at the University of East Anglia, UEA, he's rushed off his feet today. So we're delighted that he's been able to make the time to join us. So there we go. Get your questions in to the GoToWebinar box down at the bottom of that GoToWebinar panel. Move the screen around if you want to make sure you can clearly see Rachel. And if you find that your web connection is not up to watching webcams as well as the presentation and listening to us, then you can just turn the webcams off. If there's anything that you miss, we'll be making a recording available of this entire webinar, and we'll send that out in the next few days, along with a certificate of attendance for anybody who attended the live broadcast. So don't worry if you miss something, don't worry if you get a knock on the door, or if you need to go and grab yourself a glass of water, you will be able to watch this again and catch up on what you missed for those few minutes. So the next person you should hear should be Kevin. So we're going to hand over control to Kevin now, who has a presentation for you. He's also going to be running a video, and he's got another poll. So Kevin, thank you for joining us. We can see you now, which is excellent. And I'm just going to make sure that we can hear you as well, and we can. So Kevin, thank you. Let's we'll see if we can see your screen next. We can currently see a desktop with a lot of icons on it. I have to admit, we perhaps should have got you on for our webinar about anxiety, because that desktop alone is enough to send my heart rate up. But now we can see your presentation. Kevin, thank you ever so much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone.
Take it away.
Well, I think one of the important things about my journey and my understanding and work around bullying and harassment is that I come at it from a range of different perspectives. I come at it in terms of the work that I do in policy and development at UCL, running a race equality charity, but also the work on the Inclusion and Diversity Committee at the Royal Society of Chemistry. And I have a number of other advisory roles, which really make bullying and harassment core business for the work that I do. And what I wanted to do during my short presentation is want to talk about and reaffirm our understanding of what we mean by bullying and harassment, because very clearly there can be a miscommunication or a misunderstanding about where that line between appropriate and inappropriate behavior falls. I also think it's relevant to then get a sense of perspective, and Ben indicated already that the RSC has done a number of reports into gender and sexual orientation and transgender related experiences in the chemical sciences. I then wanted to think about what we can do, especially in the context of COVID-19. We really are living in an unprecedented time, and as I sit here in my living room, I think it's, I'm just reaching out to you in a range of different ways, but I think it's important that we understand how bullying and harassment might change because our behaviors have changed and our working patterns have. Anyone familiar with Athena Swan or the Race Equality Charter will know that we love data, and I think numbers are really helpful to understand why bullying and harassment is important. So I've shared some numbers from Advance HE, which is the higher education sector body that promotes equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I've really wanted to highlight this because for me, it's about power. And there are a couple of slides here that are really important. The first, when we look at professors by gender, 25.5% of our professors in 2017-18 were female. However, when we look at the undergraduate population, it's around 55%. And consequently, what we see is a definite representation gap between the start of our career journey and the end of it. For race, it's more acute. When we look at Black and Asian students, according to Advance HE, 26% of first-year undergraduates from England were domiciled in England were Black or Asian in 2016-17. Just under 9% of professors are from Black and Asian communities, and the figure for Black professors is even smaller at 0.6%. So the numbers and the representation gap is quite acute. So I thought it's helpful to start with numbers. I then thought it would be helpful to think about what do we mean by bullying and harassment. So I'm going to share a video with you. Bear with me while I just change into the video. That's okay. Here we go.
A lot has been done to prevent workplace bullying and harassment. The truth, however, is that we still have a long way to go. For example, a recent report found that one barrier to women's retention and progression in the chemical sciences is widespread discrimination, harassment and bullying. But what exactly are bullying and harassment? Bullying is offensive, intimidating, malicious or insulting behaviour. It's an abuse or misuse of power through means intended to undermine, humiliate, denigrate or injure the recipient. Harassment is unwanted conduct affecting a person's dignity and can relate to a range of characteristics. Those accused of such behaviour are not always aware they've caused offence. A key understanding, however, is not whether the conduct was intended on the part of the perpetrator, but whether it was unwanted on the part of the recipient. A good question to ask is, would a reasonable person observing such behaviour see it as bullying or harassment? If you witness such behaviour, think about how you can be an active bystander. After all, we know when something's wrong. Imagine sailing solo in a hired boat and it springs a leak. That's the boat hire company's problem, right? Even so, you wouldn't think twice about taking action. That's the attitude we need to fix bullying and harassment. Ask if there's active bystander training available in your institution. And remember, good role models aren't just good scientists, they're good people.
So the Royal Society for Chemistry launched that video last December, and the purpose behind it was very clear. We hear, as I said earlier, people talk about bullying and harassment. Well, some people will say it's just a behavior, it's just a joke. What we wanted to do was just think about and get people to reflect about what type of behaviors they're observing, what type of behaviors they may be perpetrating or doing, and actually then to take a step back and say, well, could this be bullying or harassment? And for colleagues watching this, I want to say we have a support line. So I've included the number on the slide. It's really helpful, one, if you need it, but also if you keep it as a record so that if you know someone who may need it, you can share it with them. Because part of what we want to do is to ensure that colleagues understand what support's available and how to access it. When we think about harassment, I always go back to the law because that's often where we distinguish between harassment and bullying. There are 9 protected characteristics. So when we think about what this might look like in terms of harassment, I've given some examples of how that translates into sexual harassment, misogyny, racial harassment, homophobic behavior, disability, hate crime, which doesn't necessarily always translate into an obvious example, but there's lots of behaviors that can be associated with people's disability. Transphobic behavior, ageist and religious discrimination, which can, for example, be Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. There are many forms of bullying, however, which don't necessarily correlate with protected characteristics under the Equality Act. Reflecting this, I wanted to understand what the extent of the problem was, because that's actually what's important here. Because people think, oh, it's only a little issue. So the RSC produced a couple of reports that Ben referred to. So I thought it'd be helpful just to give you some data on this. So when we looked at the physical sciences and LGBT community, 16% of respondents said that they'd personally experienced harassment or other exclusionary behavior. 30% reported witnessing exclusionary behavior. Now that's the difference between the two is quite common. So I've been working in this space for a number of years, and actually very often people witness more behavior than they report in terms of personal experience. And unsurprisingly, members of the minoritized community, in this case the LGBT community, reported higher levels of exclusionary behavior at 18%. though it wasn't the same for all LGBT plus communities, with trans and non-binary respondents actually saying that they experienced higher levels of negative behavior. Numbers don't tell the whole story. And I think it's important, though, that we have the numbers so we can get a sense of what the proportions of the problems are, and then think about how organizations and as individuals we might want to think about responding. I then drew a quotation. I wanted to take a quotation from the Breaking the Barriers report that was launched in 2018. And the quotation essentially said, I personally experienced an academic environment of exclusion and derogatory shaming in front of colleagues. This has occurred from senior colleagues with particularly difficult circumstances with one. When I've reported this to management, there has been little done. I've been told that I need to handle such issues. Now, this qualitative response is really important because this really brings home the impact of what bullying and harassment does on the individual. Because it's okay to have the numbers, but the impact is actually quite problematic. It's problematic from a number of fronts. One, because people are not able to be themselves or reach their potential at work. It's problematic because it's actually distracting from doing what you want to do. It's not a right thing to experience. And what this also shows in this particular quote is actually the failure of the organization to have effective responses. You know, this is something I need to handle. The systems don't work. And actually, that's a message that's come across from a number of different reports. I also thought it would be helpful to share some information on racial harassment, partly because of Black Lives Matter, which has really been preoccupying a lot of media and taking up a lot of news in the last few months. But it's really just to understand that the university sector is not immune to racism. The Equality and Human Rights Commission produced a report last year called Tackling Racial Harassment, Universities Challenged. It found some really stark figures, but they're not surprising. So nearly one in four Black and Asian minority ethnic students reported experiencing racial harassment. 1 in 5 students had been physically attacked. What was really and these numbers are just shocking for the scale of them, but it resulted in 1 in 20 students said they left their studies due to racial harassment. Staff, the proportions are similar, with 1/4 of staff saying they experienced racist name-calling or insults, and 15% of staff said racial harassment caused them to leave their jobs. Now, when you think about higher education as a sector, and for most organizations, staffing is our most expensive resource. It's our most critical asset, but actually staff are experiencing bullying and harassment, which is causing them to suffer. There's an emotional stress, but there's also an organizational cost. And that is actually something that is relevant for organizations to consider. And I wanted to flag up COVID-19. So I'm moving on to this because actually it's changed so much of the way that we work. If this had been a normal presentation as we would have done it before March, I would be standing in a room and hopefully seeing many of you here in front of me. At the moment, I'm looking at a screen and hoping that the message that I'm sharing with you is being understood. But the pandemic has really challenged people's ability to work. So we know from the surveys that are being undertaken in organizations that the pandemic is impacting, one, the practical implications of work, particularly wet lab-based research, but it's also leading to increased isolation, differences in caring responsibilities, which have very clear gender impact, but also for those who are living further away from their families and support network, the ability to provide care is actually being challenged. The use of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and through working from home is also causing different patterns of working to emerge, which may or may not make it easier for some to do their job. But for those who might be escaping, and so in some ways the period away from office-based or lab-based work has actually given a respite to direct contact with potential bullies or harassers in the workplace, it does mean that people may be coming into your homes through Microsoft Teams or Zoom. People are also worried about employment, and for some, work may be a place to escape from a domestic situation which may not be ideal. And so we really need to understand how bullying and harassment can be affecting people differently in the context of the pandemic and the ways of working that have really changed. Because on the one hand, whilst offering flexibility and opportunities, they may be challenging others to actually meet and do their job, but also to have a bully and a harassment-free environment. So change, for me, I describe organizations and teams that I work in as a whisper bar. I like chocolates. I'm a diabetic, so I shouldn't really be eating too much of it. But if you think of a whisper bar, it's a lot of bubbles. It's a bubbly chocolate with a lovely veneer on the outside. But what makes it really difficult for bullying and harassment to be eradicated is that we often don't understand what's happening in every part of the organization that we work in. Change is really challenging in many organizations, and I've chosen a picture of a glacier to symbolize this. Glaciers have a tendency to move rather slowly, and in most universities and many organizations, change, particularly systemic change, can be quite challenging. For me, the work that we have to do, and it's a challenge for all of us if we want to deliver change, is to have the tension of a suspension bridge. Because whilst I want us to bridge together different communities and different groups and interests, and actually how do we challenge better behavior by having challenging conversations. And so I've chosen Brunel's suspension bridge as a symbol of tension, but also as an opportunity to change and to bridge divisions. And the final point here is about systemic change versus individual change. I would like every individual to be able to realize their potential in their organization. However, we need processes and policies in place through systemic change, which I symbolize as a tanker, to deliver that. And so what do we need to do as individuals and organizations to change this? So bullying and harassment requires change agents, and we are all, depending on our role and functions, able to be change agents. So we need to think about what mechanisms organizations have. So what the research is showing is that reporting systems for bullying and harassment aren't working. The Equality and Human Rights Commission report on racial harassment identified that on average, there are about 2 to 3 reports per institution formally being recorded by the universities that participated. We need processes that deliver responses and work for individuals, but also for the organization. And the next speaker, David, is going to talk about that work. But more importantly, we need clear leadership and expectations around bullying and harassment and what organizations need to deliver. For individuals, and this is the real challenge, is what do we want to do when we experience bullying and harassment? And it's a very, very personal question, because we know that bullying and harassment is non-consensual, it's intrusive, and it can leave an individual feeling very exposed and often, sometimes, feeling that they don't have any support. So in working around bullying and harassment, it's very important that we're clear about what do we want to get out of the process and what's the outcome that we want to see. Finally, when we're looking at bystanders, this is the most important thing that we may take away, because when we looked at the data, we thought about bullying and harassment and around bystanders and their understanding of what they experience and the higher rate of observed bullying and harassment. And what we need to think about is, what can I do differently? What can I do to help change culture in the organization or the department? And what might I be able to do if I witness something to support colleagues? Now, before I move on, I want to offer Ben and ask Ben if he wouldn't mind doing the poll, the second poll. So
certainly. So this is our second poll of today's webinar, and what we'll see on screen very shortly is the second question. We want to know if you have witnessed or experienced bullying and or harassment in your workplace, and if you have, did you feel it was adequately dealt with by your institution? So there are 3 options in this question. There is simply no, you are one of the fortunate people who have never experienced or witnessed any bullying or harassment. There is you have witnessed it, but you feel that your institution adequately dealt with it. It was a one-off that was dealt with one way or another. Or you have experienced it or witnessed it, and you don't feel your institution dealt with it. So once again, we're going to go briefly quiet so that we can get your answers. Do quickly answer, and we will come back very soon. There we go. Right, I will share these results. So again, we we'll be able to see on screen what the results are. This may mean that you can't see Rachel. So I'll tell you first, while Rachel is still on screen, 24% say they haven't experienced or witnessed any bullying or harassment. 10% say they have, and it was effectively addressed by their institution, but overwhelmingly, 65% of our audience today say that they have witnessed or been subject to bullying or harassment, and they feel it was not effectively addressed. Just to give you a visual idea of that, I will share this just for a few seconds. And there we go. Thank you very much to everybody for completing that poll. Kevin, this seems to just back up the other data that you've already shown us, that this is widespread, underreported, and affects a significant number of people across the chemical sciences.
Yes, and I think that's why it's so important that we start to deal with it, because it's affecting people's lives, but more importantly, it's wrong. We worked so hard to enable people to access organizations. We try so hard to ensure that we widen participation, but if actually communities that are minoritized experience increased levels of bullying and harassment, and organizations have systems that fail to deal with this, all that effort is in vain, and we end up having wasted talent. In terms of the final slide that I wanted to just summarize, I think the important part is that knowledge matters. And when we talk about supporting and understanding what type of responses we can have, it's so important to know what training and support services you as individuals have access to in your organizations. And it's important that you do this before a problem arises, so that if you can be a bystander that supports a colleague, or whether you need this for yourself, you're able to know what the organization says it's committed to. Becoming an active bystander does not mean putting yourself at risk. And looking at the video from the Royal Society, the RSC's video, the Royal Society of Chemistry's video, it's about making sure that you understand what is appropriate, what's not, understand what support systems are available, and how you can engage and support and challenge where appropriate. One of the ways to do this is to actually understand what your organization is committed to. In higher education, bullying and harassment is included in Athena's font submissions and race equality charter submissions. And if your organization is a Stonewall diversity champion, which many are, both within higher education and beyond, bullying and harassment and effective bullying and harassment remedies are also integral to those awards. The disability standard also includes work on this. So for me, the key message is don't wait, get involved. Because if we all take an active role in changing local cultures, it can actually make a difference in the long run to how the organization works. Now, this comes with leadership responsibility being higher. So we're very lucky that David's here to help share what a senior leader in higher education has done to help change culture. And we're finally remembering, the way that we work now is very different because of the pandemic. And it's really important that we reflect on what behaviors and what expectations we have of colleagues, whether we're managers or staff, about what might be becoming bullying or harassment behavior. And it might be very simple things like changing working patterns, hours, expectations about meeting times. But if you have any doubts and you need any support, the RSC support line is there for you. So take a note of the number and use it if you need it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions later on.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Some very sobering numbers, but a really good start to make sure that we understand the extent of the problem that we're facing. So the next guest is going to be David Richardson. He's Vice Chancellor at the University of East Anglia. He's currently Chair of the University's UK Advisory Group to tackle racial harassment in higher education. He was a member of the University's UK Task Force that authored the Changing the Culture report that provided recommendations for a whole institution approach to tackling violence against women, harassment and hate crime affecting university students. He has a presentation with a series of different resources. So we will be sending out the resources. They'll be on screen, but we'll also send them out into this chat box. So do keep an eye out for the links there, as well as copying them down from what you see on screen. David, once again, thank you so much for joining us, especially on such a busy and unusual day for you. Really appreciate it.
It's an absolute pleasure, Ben, and thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful that we've got, you know, over 300 attendees with us to discuss this really, you know, important problem. And thanks, Kevin, also for nicely capturing the extent of the issues that we face and that we need to tackle together. I'm actually going to specifically talk to you about one area, and that's racial harassment and institutional racism in higher education. And I'm not going to talk specifically about issues in chemistry departments or the chemistry sector more widely. I don't have the granularity of knowledge to do that. In fact, I'm hoping to have a better understanding of that at the end of this webinar. But as a Vice-Chancellor, I can talk about this problem in institutional terms. And I actually believe that every subject discipline in universities is impacted by racism and racial harassment. And I also believe that we're in a key moment in higher education history where we can actually ask a couple of important questions. First, how can universities harness the momentum behind the Black Lives Matter movement, mentioned of course by Kevin a few moments ago, as a moment for tangible, permanent action to address racial inequality affecting students and staff? And the second related to that is, what are the immediate and longer term steps that universities should be taking to address structural racism? And what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just make 3 key points and refer you to a few links that that will be on the slide that I think might appear in a moment and will certainly be made available to you, that you might want to explore further, either while I'm speaking or after the webinar is over. Now, my starting point is to acknowledge that institutional racism exists and that there are systemic issues in our universities. Now, this is a painful and difficult thing to acknowledge, but it must be acknowledged. And Vice-Chancellors must do what I'm doing and call this out. Only by acknowledging that we have this problem can we begin to solve it. Now, people will be worried about the reputation issues that come with that. Don't. Reputation will be enhanced by recognizing the problem and then putting in real actions to deal with it. So it's just one example of how I got into tackling these sort of areas historically, was that I was part of the original Universities UK task force that produced the Change in the Culture guidance in 2016. This guidance was on tackling violence against women, harassment and hate crimes of all kinds. And it's an action-based guidance that's designed to help institutional leaders turn words into measurable actions, and actions that bring about cultural change. You can see a link to that report in the link number 1 on the slide. Now, it began by acknowledging that we had a problem, by telling universities that they had to expose the full scale of that problem by putting in place efficient reporting mechanisms, and then giving guidance on how to tackle it, report and support. Work closely with students to do this, involve students as partners, work closely with your staff, and also ensure that you set yourself up as a Vice-Chancellor to report to your boss, the governing body, and make sure that they are monitoring the progress that you're making. Now, in terms of working in partnership with our students, we at UEA did some very imaginative things with our students, led by students who are wonderfully creative and innovative. And we did that through our joint Never Okay campaign. There's some memorable images of me actually doing guerrilla graffiti, highlighting the issues that, the unacceptable issues around harassment and bullying that were reported in the Change in the Culture guidance through spray canning these issues all around campus. I should hasten to add in paint that would come off in the rain. Now, we did that overnight so that parents and students arriving, our new students in the September we did it, would actually see how seriously we took it and were seeking to address it. We obviously followed it up with communications. But I can tell you, some of my colleagues, when they woke up in the morning and found this graffiti, were very shocked and of course asked for it to be removed and asked for people to, you know, find out who the vandals were. Well, the security cameras showed the vandal to be the Vice-Chancellor. So you can see how this is an imaginative way that a Vice-Chancellor can get involved in highlighting the issues, acknowledging them, but then following that up with communications to students and parents and staff about how we're going to tackle them. Now, there are many things that we did, and I don't have time to go into all of them, though I happily will in the Q&A session. But in some areas, the Change in the Culture guidance has been successful. Not all, and there's much more we need to do across all universities. But Universities UK did some research recently called Evaluation of Change in the Culture 2 years on. And unfortunately, it showed that this same level of priority on tackling some forms of harassment, such as sexual harassment, has not been afforded to tackling racial harassment to date. And that's simply not acceptable. And you can find that in the third link that you can see on that slide. Now, alongside this report, published at a very similar time, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published the University Challenge report that Kevin has just referred to. And also, the British Medical Association published a report on racial harassment experienced by trainee medics. And these two reports also highlighted the really unacceptable issues that universities had to acknowledge and tackle urgently. Now, on top of these reports, I've been talking to students from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds, and they were sharing with me in various fora some of the experiences that they've had, experiences of racial harassment that were taking place in my university, for example, in seminars and practical classes, yes, in the sciences, quite a lot in the sciences actually, deeply upsetting experiences that moved me greatly, and the students were very brave to tell me about them. I pledged to them that I would tackle these issues, I would eradicate these issues from my university. But quite rightly, the Black, Asian, minority ethnic students I was talking to wanted action, not words. And of course, I could try to tackle this culturally within UEA, but I knew the whole sector had to tackle this. This was not just a UEA issue, as highlighted by the EHRC report. So this takes me to my second point, the action, not words. We don't need to collect any more evidence that universities across all subject areas in this country are systemically racist. It's painful, as I said before, to say it. We do not need more evidence for that. Repeatedly asking Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students and staff to tell their stories, to capture their experiences before instigating action, only serves to re-traumatize. And why should we want to do that? And it delays, and it may prevent finding and implementing solutions. We have a problem, Vice Chancellors have to acknowledge it, we know it, so let's take action now. So to help institutions take action, Universities UK invited me to chair its Racial Harassment Advisory Group. Now that first convened in autumn 2019, and it's met several times since. It draws from a range of sectors, and it draws from both within the sector and expertise outside the sector. It includes a Black, Asian, minority ethnic student group chaired by the National Union of Students, and also a Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff group, all feeding in to the work that we were doing. It's going to take a problem-focused, action-orientated approach supported by case studies which we're drawing from within and out with the sector. This speaks for the fact that we need action, not words now, and we want to help universities with those action-orientated approaches. It will build on successes where we've had successes through taking this approach with the original Change in the Culture guidance, and also more recently around guidance that we've put out around mental health and wellbeing through the hashtag Step Change guidance from Universities UK. The guidance that we're producing is now in its third and final iteration. In fact, I was working on it just today, and it will be published in the early autumn. Now, you can find some articles related to the advisory group I chair in links 6 and 7, should you wish to, but as I say, we're now within a month or so of us actually publishing that guidance. Now, for some sector leaders, what I'm saying, what I'm calling out, will feel discomforting, and what they read in the guidance when we publish it will feel discomforting. And I'll be the first to admit that, as self-evidently a white person with no lived experience of racism or racial harassment, then taking action to address racism has taken me way outside of my comfort zone, and I have made mistakes along the way. But working with people who have the lived experiences, they've helped me. They've helped me understand when I've made mistakes, and they've helped me move forward in positive ways. I still feel outside my comfort zone. I feel outside my comfort zone talking about this now. And that would be true of many university leaders. but I think at least I can help them make that journey to understanding it will feel uncomfortable, but you must, as leaders, do this. As leaders, we are not doing our job effectively if we do nothing while a significant proportion of our staff and student bodies are suffering from harassment and so therefore experiencing poor outcomes and ultimately not thriving the way we would want them to thrive in our university communities. So that then takes me to my third key point, wider actions. It's important to recognise that efforts to address racial harassment in isolation are not enough. There's numerous other ways in which I believe we must address racism and racial inequalities. As university leaders, we should focus on a range of concrete activities in this area, including addressing ethnicity pay gaps, increasing representation, tackling degree awarding gaps, and embracing decolonisation in all subject areas. All subjects can embrace decolonisation. I'll be happy to explore ways in which we're approaching this at UEA in the Q&A discussions later. In a university, institutional racism is not just the problem of those suffering from it. It's not just the problem of those suffering the injustices that result from it. It's a problem for the whole university community. And so the whole university community must work together to own the challenge together, led by the Vice-Chancellor, who is the leader of that community. But we mustn't just let the people in the community take the burden of tackling these issues. We have to do that as one community. So our recommendations to the sector will be structured around 10 areas. I think they might be getting captured on the slide for you at some point by the Royal Society of Chemistry. Oh, some of them are coming up now. Visible and meaningful senior leadership. I'm talking about that now. Vice Chancellors have to make themselves visible and own this. And resource it effectively. We do need to incorporate the voices of lived experience. We don't want them to be putting them under stress by reliving their experiences all the time, but we have to learn from their lived experiences and use those lived experiences to help us all as a community move forward. It has to be an institutional-wide strategy. It can't just be in one subject area or others. It has to be institutional-wide for our one community, owned by our community. We do need to increase the understanding of what racial harassment is and its impacts throughout the university. Not everybody recognises racial harassment in all of its different forms, and some of it is not intentional, but all of it is unacceptable. We therefore need to define terminologies, create a common understanding of racial harassment and what it is in all of its forms. That requires training. Training of leaders, but training of all staff, and indeed training of our students. I'm getting all of our leadership to do white ally training. Sadly, our key executive team is all white. That's something that I need to address in my university, but we are doing the ally training. So increasing understanding of racism and racial harassment from an anti-racist perspective is part of that. We've heard a little bit about the impact of COVID-19. Of course, much of our education has moved online. We have to now tackle racial harassment that people experience online now more than ever, because we'll continue to have a lot of online provision, certainly in a blended way as we return to our campuses. Developing reporting systems. Many universities have developed reporting systems that are now much better for capturing sexual harassment and gender-based violence, but there is terrible underreporting of racial harassment. We need to put in place reporting systems that people believe in, that people believe safe in, and that they will get adequate responses to. We have to be able to collect and analyse the data on reporting. Only by knowing the extent of the problem can we then tackle the problem. And we need to evaluate measures to drive continuous improvement so that, for example, we actually know what success looks like, and also that we're able to report regularly to our governing bodies, who ultimately are responsible for monitoring that improvement and make sure that me as a Vice-Chancellor, I'm actually managing to tackle these problems effectively. So in closing, sometimes university leaders have argued that we need patience and that culture change takes time. This is Kevin's glacier, isn't it? But it's clear that people have run out of patience, and rightly so. We showed as a sector how quickly we can change the delivery model of nigh on 150 universities across the UK in a few days in March in response to COVID-19. When we moved our provision online, we did that in just a few days, a couple of weeks. So we're not always glaciers, are we? So my challenge to the sector will be to see similar fast progress in turning action into words on all forms of racism, including racial harassment and discrimination in our institutions. And that's what I intend to lead the sector on when we publish our guidance. So thanks very much, and I look forward to the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, David. And that's a really good point about getting out of our comfort zone. It's only really when we're outside of our comfort zones that we really start to grow and to develop. And it's important to remember that my comfort zone is not the same as somebody else's comfort zone. So if I'm doing everything I can to remain within that, I'm automatically excluding other people. And that's really not how we want to make a welcoming, inclusive environment for people to work in.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Thanks again, David. So our next, third and final guest before we come to Q&A is Carol Mundell. Now, she is Professor of Extragalactic Astronomy and the Head of Astrophysics at the University of Bath, and is currently Chief Scientific Advisor at the Foreign Commonwealth Office. She's a committed and sought-after communicator of science to the public in the UK and overseas, and a vocal advocate for equality and diversity in science. We are utterly delighted to have you with us, Carol, and I know from the conversations that we've had in the run-up to today's presentation that this is going to be fascinating, engaging and challenging in equal measure. So thank you once again for joining us, and we'll come back for Q&A a bit later on. Final reminder, get your questions in at the bottom of the GoToWebinar panel and we will put them to our panel afterwards. So get those questions in now. I shall hand over to Carol. Thanks again for joining us.
Ben, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to speak to you, but also on a very challenging and difficult topic. And I've been very struck by the data that Kevin showed us, and particularly in the polls. So I know that there are many people who'll be listening to this call who will be looking for solutions, looking for understanding, and also maybe finding this a very difficult conversation. What I would like to do is draw back and give a global view to begin with. From my first 2 years at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, I'm there for 3 days a week, and I lead on science diplomacy, science advice to government, and our place in the world. And I've seen the huge value of our university sector, particularly during COVID, and the wonderful research that is now at the forefront of making the world a better place. And so I really feel very strongly that making sure that our academic and our research collaborations in our educational sector is a safe and inclusive place is absolutely paramount, because otherwise we can't do our best work and we can't reach the widest number of people. I think, as you've heard from David and Kevin, you know, we are far from being there, and we must continue to work on these challenging issues. And I think our young people coming forward with the courage that they have, with raising their voices and asking their leaders to do better, is a real opportunity for change. But what I'd like to do is give you a few statistics to start with about the effects of inequality. And I'm going to put this through a gender lens to begin with. But obviously, you know, race, class, every other kind of intersection starts to then make these issues even more challenging. But just some very basic statistics, because we see that inequality is holding the world back and preventing the development of secure, stable and prosperous societies. 130 million girls globally do not have access to education. And in conflict zones, girls are more than 2.5 times more likely to be out of school than boys. On current trends, it will take about 170 years to close the global gender pay gap. There's a real glacier for you. And if women had the same role in the labour markets as men do, up to an estimated $28 trillion, 26% of the GDP as calculated last year, could be added to the global GDP. So even if we go beyond ethics, it makes good business sense to harness all our talent. And in the field of science, technology, engineering and mathematics, many fewer girls than boys study these subjects, and also digital subjects. And of course, these are usually the higher paying subjects, lead to higher paying careers. Fewer women than men enter and remain in those STEM careers. In the UK, only 26% of core STEM graduates are women. And in other countries, I know the number is even smaller. And of course, as we've all seen through the COVID crisis, crucially, science, innovation and research really are essential They play an essential role in finding solutions to many of our common challenges we face in the world today. Our biggest global challenges, such as climate change, biodiversity loss, global pandemics, antimicrobial resistance and aging societies, affects countries around the world in ways that have become acutely impactful, as we've seen over the last few months. And so it really is in all of our interests to ensure that we harness the full potential that we have to take advantages of the opportunities that lie ahead to address these big global challenges. Within the UK, diversity, inclusion and the promotion of STEM education and professions are among the top priorities of the UK government, and more important than ever as we recover from this pandemic crisis. In the UK's industrial strategy, which was published a couple of years ago, we committed to boosting UK productivity and earning power. And in order to do so, addressing the shortage of STEM and digital skills really sat at the heart of that strategy. Since 2018, the government's invested an additional £406 million in maths, digital and technical education, as well as £1.3 billion in research and innovation talent. And last year, the UK government published its strategy, Gender Equality at All Stages, a Roadmap for Change. So it's very clearly written down that the roadmap commits to address persistent gender barriers at different stages of life. So that's a real call to arms across our whole society. And our learned and professional societies are working incredibly hard to help our research sectors to tackle the bias at all stages in education, skills and the career pipeline. And I know that the Royal Society of Chemistry is a real exemplar in this. The Breaking the Barriers report and also the gender bias in academic publishing really are gold standards in evidence-based. And I think, as you said, Kevin, here are some statistics, and David said, let's move to action. It really are the data that we can take when we actually show those to people. It's what really changes people's minds. Many people who are well-meaning, who say, well, maybe it's not such a big problem, or gosh, that sounds a bit shocking, I once heard an anecdote. When you put the evidence on their table and say, read it, this is a robust evidence-based piece of research, they really are usually very moved to say, what can we do to fix this? And really the programs that address wider decision-making factors that can affect young people's choices to pursue STEM, such as developing teachers' awareness of inclusive teaching techniques and whole school projects to raise awareness amongst staff of gender stereotyping, unconscious bias, sexist, racist and exclusionary language, and developing options to address them are really important. That's the beginning of the pipeline. It's how it shapes our young people's thinking and their experiences as they go on in their educational and their career journeys. But of course, even if we succeed at that, filling the start of the pipeline is not enough. And you've heard some very difficult things on the previous two talks about the culture that young people, and particularly young women or racial minorities, will experience if they come into our sector. The WISE campaign, for instance, has established a network of STEM advocates, diverse women working in science, technology and engineering in and out of the academic sector. And the goal there is to promote gender balance at the highest levels and really to show that these role models can and have made their way through their different career paths. And really the campaign's vision of achieving equality in STEM from classroom to boardroom is ultimately the goal. And as David said in his talk, it's the leadership at the top which is absolutely vital, but it has to be throughout the whole system. Athena Swan, as Kevin was talking about, really also is a phenomenally powerful and impressive mechanism. It's established in 2005, the Athena Swan Charter, to promote gender equality and support the role of women in STEM and higher education. And it's now being broadened. I know other parts of the academic sector beyond STEM have really started to adopt this, and we're talking about whether we should go beyond gender and how to do that. But actually, Athena Swan has been adopted by over 160 universities and research institutes in the UK and now in Ireland and Australia. And the UK's largest provider of clinical research, the National Institute for Health Research, requires funded projects to demonstrate equality through Athena Swan Charter. And again, data and the commentary on those data really sit at the heart of why Athena Swan is effective when it works. And of course, these initiatives, and as David said, guidance actually is not enough to drive change. These initiatives also need to be accompanied by legislation, and this is where governments can help to drive the change that we need to see. One example is the UK's 2017 gender pay gap reporting legislation. This was amongst the first of its time globally. And this legislation made it a legal requirement for organisations with 250 or more employees to report annually on their gender pay gap. and companies are also encouraged to publish an action plan to show how they intend to address their gaps. And what was really interesting, speaking to people in a number of different sectors whose companies and organisations did publish their gender pay gap report, it was interesting that the organisations that felt that they had very good inclusive processes and they didn't have a problem were very surprised when they found that they did have gender pay gaps. It can be very complex as to why that's there. It can be institutional and organisational hidden structural bias and barriers that stop equality and closing that gap. It might be direct discrimination. It might be all sorts of things, including the workplace culture. And then again, more broadly, in 2018, the UK put women and girls at the heart of its foreign policy, launching its Leave No Girl Behind campaign at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2018 and calling for 12 years of quality education for girls. Something that, again, it's good to keep in mind in the UK, that not everybody around the world has equitable access to any education. 2020 was expected to be a landmark year on the global stage, with celebrations of the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and the 20th anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. But of course, with the widespread nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're seeing very clearly already in data that's being gathered that there is a real risk that even the limited gains made in the past decades are at risk of being rolled back, highlighting really the existing inequalities in all of our communities, which disproportionately affect women and girls, but not exclusively. And as I say, academia is no exception. We're already seeing evidence of the disproportionate impact of the lockdown on working patterns, as Kevin mentioned in his talk. And as I say, this is just one lens to look at inequality. More broadly, as we look across at LGBTQ+, as Kevin said at the beginning, really important to look at that wider diversity. The UK was proud to be a founding member of the Equal Rights Coalition to advance the human rights of LGBT+ persons and promote inclusive development. And the UK continues to energise the work of the coalition and address the key issues faced by people globally, including violence and discrimination and ongoing criminalisation for same-sex conduct in 69 countries. So as I say, that intersection of race, class, disability, sexual orientation, these are all differences that should be celebrated and harnessed, but actually can often be used as instruments of abuse and of pain. And in the academic culture, I mean, one of the questions that often comes up, that it's a competitive culture, do the means justify the end? And of course, if we don't have integrity in our culture and our conduct, then that feeds directly into a lack of trust in the research that we produce and in the educational qualifications that we emerge with. It really is the heart of our sector. Integrity is really very important. It's vital for the integrity of the research and the applications of that research, and its influence for good in the world and the wider public trust, because after all, much of our research is publicly funded, that we have integrity in the way we treat one another in our organisations. And I think from a personal perspective, I work in big international collaborations. I am a white woman in a very white male-dominated field. I'm a physicist by background, which is not dissimilar to chemistry, although I think possibly chemistry is doing better than physics at the moment in terms of culture and in terms of diversity. And what we see in academia in some ways is a very special environment. It's almost an apprenticeship environment, but it's also not a special environment when it comes to employment law. So no university is above the law. The power imbalance that Kevin mentioned, I think, is also key to this issue. So PIs and seniors control access to networks, to resources, to facilities, and that's where some of the power imbalances can come from. But of course, bullying and harassment can happen in all directions. It can happen from seniors to juniors, from juniors to seniors, peers to peers, amongst the student population, from staff to students and from students to staff, and also across the academic professional services boundary in each direction. And I think one of the things that strikes me really is the need for the clear leadership, the value proposition and the processes, but also the training, as we've heard already today, about bystander interventions and making time to have respectful conversation about workplace behaviours, because ultimately it's about professional behaviour in the workplace. Our organisations are places where we are all adults, but actually professionalism and courtesy and respect really are the start of that conversation. And of course, really at the heart of all of this are boundaries. And this is again something that we've heard of today in the COVID context. Where are individuals' boundaries? How do those boundaries interact with others, as Ben said, inside or outside of your comfort zone? And that also goes more broadly into in-groups and out-groups, inclusion and exclusion. It can happen with microaggressions in very small groups. That can very quickly grow into whole department cultures and whole organizational cultures. And it can actually be sometimes very difficult for organizational leaders to see that happening. As David said, the granularity and also the time delay. By the time a very serious, egregious failure reaches the ears of the Vice Chancellor, it's often many weeks, months or years of poor behaviours and poor culture at the departmental, the group or the individual level. And I think to finish, what I'd like to say is I think there is real hope and opportunity for change here, but that will only come about if we have very clear language that we can use when we have these conversations. Often we're very uncomfortable about using the right kinds of words when we describe behaviours and we describe conduct and we describe our feelings and how that makes us feel. Anyone who's been at the end of bullying or harassment or uncomfortable situations, it creates physical illness as well as mental strain. And so it has real impacts on individuals and also the performance of organisations. I think there is much to learn about management. Academics often are not trained to be managers, and so I think there's real opportunity to improve there. How we engage with HR departments and how our legal systems and our legal advisors within our universities deal with these sorts of situations. And I think, as David mentioned, reputation is a really important issue. And I know that many organisations worry about reputational damage, and that can create a culture of silence. We can't talk about these things. We have to pretend they don't exist. For me, it happens in society. Racial discrimination, racial abuse, sexual harassment, all sorts of bullying and harassment. People do this. And it's not whether it happens in an organisation, but it's how an organisation responds when it happens that, for me, is a measure of the quality of that organisation. And that, I think, is what I would urge the leaders of our universities to think about when they're thinking about reputational damage. Expediency is not going to help your reputations, and covering up poor behaviour is not going to help your reputations, because ultimately the news of how your organisation responds to problems does come out. People talk, students leave, staff leave, people travel around the world. And what we want to do is actually fix these issues, talk about them, and actually learn together how to address these inequalities that are holding our sector back, so that we can get on with the best possible work and be a real force for good in the world. So I'll stop there, and I really look forward to hearing your questions and hope to give some answers as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol. Fantastic contribution to quite a tense conversation that we need to have, and some of the questions that we're asking are quite challenging. I would like to invite Kevin and David back to join us for a Q&A session now. Now, normally in a webinar, by way of saying thank you and acknowledging you for your contribution, I would say the name of the person who has asked a question. Today, we're dealing with quite a sensitive topic, and so I'm not going to do that. So don't feel that I have ignored your question. I'm just not going to put any names on these this time round. And one thing that has come up repeatedly that I think I'd like to put to all three of you, really, what would be your advice for somebody who is currently experiencing bullying or harassment in the workplace? Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Kevin, what would be your top tip for somebody who feels that they're in that situation? What should they do?
I'm sorry, was that directed at me, Ben?
Yes, let's start with you, and then
Okay,
David and through to Carol.
Okay, the first thing that I would say that I'd ask anybody to say, I'd ask the person that's experiencing this the question, what do you want to get out of whatever you want from the situation? And the reason why I ask that is the world that we work in is relatively small. So I know that people have certain degrees of tolerances around stresses. And Carolyn mentioned about the mental and the physical stresses that bullying and harassment cause on individuals. And so my first question and advice is, what is it that you want to get? Is it justice? Is it the behavior to stop? Is it an exit strategy? And because the reality is that it's not an easy thing to say, oh yes, you must fight this and follow the policy and procedure, because as colleagues have indicated in the poll, the confidence in the systems isn't there. And so the real question has to go back to, what is it that you can take and tolerate? What is it that you're willing to accept? And then in a negotiation, we'll say, what does that fit in between? What is my next best alternative? And so that would be my starting point, because for me, it's the welfare of the individual that comes first. Organizations have the responsibility, in my mind, to actually have systems that work, but we know that they don't work always. And actually, for the majority of respondents, they don't work. So the starting question is always, what is it that you want to get out, and what is it that you will be able to live with and accept?
Thank you, Kevin. David, what would you add to that? What would be your advice to somebody who's currently experiencing bullying or harassment in their workplace?
I think there's a range of approaches. That person has to begin by actually the response will partly depend on where that bullying and harassment is coming from. If it's coming from the line manager, then clearly the line manager is not an option to speak to, either formally or informally. But every line manager has another manager, so there is somewhere I think that people can go. I have another manager. It's my governing body. So always bear in mind that it doesn't always have to be your line manager if that's actually where the problems are coming from. It might not be, but that might. Now, some people don't want to talk directly to any particular individual. They might prefer to talk anonymously. We have in place report and support systems where people can go online and actually report anonymously online, or phone lines that they can phone up and talk to someone who can provide wellbeing support through that route, and talk them through what their options might be, get a little bit more of a sense of what they're experiencing, and then talk them through what their options might be. As part of that, we actually changed our HR division into a people and culture division. A lot of universities have HR divisions. We put in place a people and culture division, which helps, as part of that, has areas where we can give support to people who are experiencing bullying and harassment. That's specifically why we did that. Actually, I'm also on the non-executive director of a regional hospital. I won't say which one, but people could guess by just looking at my campus and seeing which hospital was on it. And I also put a people and culture committee in place there as well, which I chair, which was also in response to the fact that that we had an issue identified by me and the board, but also by the CQC, that there was a culture of bullying developing and lots of whistleblowing. So again, we put in place a people and culture committee, replacing the HR division with this much more supportive division to help provide many different channels through which people could feel comfortable in reporting, either anonymously or on the record.
Thank you very much. Carol, I appreciate we've had some very good answers there. What would be your advice to somebody who's in that situation?
I think, Ben, I would draw it more broadly, and I think Kevin and David's advice is absolutely right. But bullying and harassment can sometimes be incredibly insidious, and so for the individual, knowing that it's happening, many cases that I've been aware of, it starts with a very slow creep. There's the plausible deniability, there's I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling strained, it's probably my imagination. And I think isolation is the most damaging part of it, especially if the culture around you, everyone else seems to be fine. It maybe is just associated with you. It can be different in different situations. You know, you may have a lab manager who shouts at everybody and creates an environment where people feel uncomfortable, and you may be able to reach out to your lab partners and say, actually, I'm feeling uncomfortable. And if you're in a group then where you can feel, you can have a talk to one another and see how to cope with it. But in many cases, that's not the case. The target may be isolated away. It can be very psychologically damaging. So I think definitely, particularly because the Royal Society of Chemistry has that independent helpline, I think that can also be very helpful to get outside of your organization. You can have that safe conversation, because safety is really important. And as Kevin then said, you can start to unpack, what am I experiencing? And how do I take agency back? Because it's very disempowering. You are at the bequest of the perpetrator or the culture or multiple people, and it then tends to grow as well, because it makes you feel less physically confident to go back into the environment where the bullying is. It makes you less able to raise your voice, and it really affects every part of your life. And some of the stories that I've I've heard, or I've been involved with, or I've supported people on, you can then unroll and you see a whole pattern of behaviours in the environment. By the time they're raising a complaint with their organisation, there have already been many opportunities to change the culture. It can be sometimes that final case that makes people wake up and say, we need to go back and have a look to see how this has happened. But for the individual, they may not know that that's all around them. They may feel that it's themselves. And again, bandwidth for knowing how to reach out. Some people feel confident at coming forward with a complaint, and they may feel very supported at that stage, but they then may find that the complaint process itself is re-traumatizing. We hear many victims saying, I told my story to my HR business manager, or I told it to my supervisor or whoever was giving the support. I went through the process and I was asked to tell my story 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Sometimes HR departments do very badly at transcribing what people say, and what you get back is a complete scramble of what was put in. It's already very traumatic for a victim to say, this is what happened to me. That's a big step for them. So I think, leaders like David, changing the culture of their HR departments and understanding how very difficult it is to report. And you don't need victims to continue to retell the same story and have it given back to them broken, because that adds insult to injury. So I think it depends very much where a person is in that process. But first of all, that sense check, that external support network, figuring out, where am I safe actually, and also, are you physically safe? The very first step may be just to remove yourself from the situation. You may call in sick for a week just to give yourself some headspace, because obviously if you're a student, you make the clock's ticking on your PhD or your degree. If you're a staff member, particularly now with all the changes with COVID, you might be under great pressure to put all of your lectures online, so you've always got something else that is driving you forward, when actually you need to step back and do some self-care, take some rest and some physical rest and some safety, and then say, where am I? What do I want to do in this situation? And then just keep an eye on how that's developing, because at any point in the situation, you can also step out and reach out for different support. It's not once that you confirm the RSC tool. You confirm the helpline twice or 3 times as you go through whatever process it is you're going through. But complex and a really difficult question, but I hope people will be able to find that support in the links that we provide after this.
So just very quickly, rsc.li/support. You can find all of the RSC resources there. David, I think we are due to lose you in very short order, unfortunately. So if you could just give us your one top point. Lots of people have asked this. The information is out there. We know this is happening. We know it's damaging. What is the roadblock that's stopping institutions and organizations from just solving this problem?
I think one of the roadblocks refers to what something Carol mentioned, and I mentioned as well. It is fear of reputation, and that's a roadblock with the governing bodies as well. I will recount a very short story, and I really apologise. I do have to go and chair a meeting. Actually, I'm vice chancellors, in fact. When I going back to 2016, 2017, when we were putting in specific initiatives to challenge and call out and tackle sexual harassment, we put in place a new report and support system. And within 12 months, an article, I think it was on ITN News, actually, it's there on the web, published a league table of reports of sexual harassment, and UEA was top of it. By some distance, by the way. I mean, like 100 more than the next university. And my governing body was straight on the front saying, what's going on here? And of course, the headline was that sexual harassment is rife in UEA. It wasn't. What we've done is put in place a good support, a report and support system that our students helped us put in place to capture the problem and then start dealing with it. And the fear of the governing body was that, of course, you'll get the sort of reputational headlines that the newspapers were producing there. I told them, you have to be ready for that. You have to be ready for that. We have to ride that. And this will enhance our reputation. This will in turn enhance our reputation. Because I've done this in partnership with our students, the Students' Union came straight in and said, no, this is a good thing. This is a result of what the Vice Chancellor has put in place with us, and it's a good thing because it's exposing the issue and we can now deal with it. And that made the governing body more comfortable, and they helped me respond to the press. And since then, we haven't been challenged by that at all, and people see us as one of the exemplar universities for putting in place mechanisms to tackle this. So that was specifically around sexual harassment, and that's what, in my case, I want the university to do around racial harassment. Be brave, ride the reputation, the possible reputation hit, because your reputation will be enhanced if you get this right and if you're seen to tackle this.
And David,
Perfect.
if I may, a comment that you could take back to your Vice Chancellors, if they feel afraid to tackle this, imagine how the victims feel.
Yeah, absolutely. Quite right.
Thank you very much, David. I'm
So
sorry that we
that
have to lose you.
I'd love to be part of the
No, that's
session.
all right.
Really.
Thank you for joining us. Let's just see if we can squeeze in a couple more questions, Carol and Kevin, before we lose you as well. One thing I've been thinking has been reflected in a few of these questions. We've mentioned that the perpetrator may not know that their behaviour, their actions are harassment or could be perceived as bullying. And that might just be because this is how my supervisor always used to treat me, and so this is how I treat the people I supervise. That's what I've learnt through my job experience to date. As far as I know, this is how the world of work or the world of academia works. How can we evaluate and be more self-aware? How can we take that step back and really understand how our behaviour is impacting other people? Carol, is that something you might have a comment on?
Yeah, sure. I think something I've learned very much in my time in the Foreign Office and across the civil service generally is that we have many open conversations throughout the organisation at every level about our values and our behaviours, and respect very much sits at the heart of that, but those values are owned throughout the organisation. But it's also formalised. So, for example, we have first responders, and then it's very much messaged from our permanent undersecretary. So it's at all levels, it's embedded throughout the department. And in fact, when you look at the outcomes from that, you know, I think as in the mid-1970s, if a woman got married, she had to leave the diplomatic service. That's not very long ago when you think about it. And now we have women in all of our major posts around the world. So Beijing, Moscow, Washington, the United Nations, not because we've had positive discrimination, but because we have had that open culture of discussion to really transform an organisation that was seen from the outside to be behind the times. So I think that's a real lesson for universities. You know, how do you treat someone else the way you would like to be treated? And also enabling people to be able to say, I don't understand that comment, but I might find it offensive, and you feeling okay with that. I think it's about your comfort zone as well. And of course, there can be an imbalance if you've got someone who is behaving in a way that doesn't feel respectful to other people. How do you enable the other people to raise their voice and say, in a neutral way, this is how I feel when you behave like that? That can also be a measure of the wider culture, because obviously if it's been going on for a long time, many people will have experienced it and will feel less able to call it out. If it's at the beginning, it's much easier to say, I'm sorry, there might be a misunderstanding here, but maybe we can roll the conversation back. And of course, if there is a power imbalance, then that adds even more difficulty to raise your voice. So I think we've had these sorts of discussions in sort of the research funding agencies, and the Wellcome Trust themselves have actually brought in sort of financial penalties to universities where there are sort of failed cases of harassment, and they will actually pull the funding. So that's the same in the US as well. That's quite a powerful way to focus an organisation on the issue. But after that, you then need to operationalize it right down to the level and think, well, actually, how might I, even if I don't have a problem with this, that's just how I feel. No one is like yourself. And so just try to, step back and think, if there's anything I'm doing here, even something well-meaning like, let's all go to the pub for a trip out at the end of a day and we'll all socialize, and we might start to talk about work-based things that will then impact how we take our work forward when we come back into the department the next day. Well, if there's someone for whatever reason doesn't drink or doesn't prefer to socialize in an alcohol-based environment, you're already discriminating. So thinking really about different people's lives, different people's challenges, and again, they may not necessarily want to talk about them. You may have family issue, you may be caring for an older relative. You don't necessarily want to have to explain, here's all my life, so that you can be inclusive to me. It's very much about respecting people have all sorts of different perspectives, and how can you make an environment that allows people to say, that won't work for me, can we try something different, without having to justify what or why.
Fantastic. I think we're probably running out of time, but one last question. I'll put this to Kevin first. And again, a couple of people have asked this. And clearly we've inspired some people, because the question they've asked is, how can I get involved in fighting against bullying and harassment at my institution? What steps can people take to try and help their colleagues, to try and enact that cultural change?
Well, the first thing I would always say is, what is your institution currently doing? Because how do you engage with what's actually being developed by the organization? So I gave the examples of the Athena Swan Charter, the Race Equality Charter. So for Athena Swan, that's being done locally. And what we're looking to do there, for example, with the charter, is to say, actually, there's a specific project, there's specific parameters around bullying and harassment. And I've seen at UCL and at Cambridge and Oxford some very good practice that's resulted because bullying and harassment has been brought out as an issue, and local responses have been driven locally. And that's required individuals who really say, actually, I care enough about this to want to make a difference. So at UCL, for example, there is a course that we run, which is called Where Do You Draw the Line, which tries to get departments to work together and teams to work together to explore how behaviors that maybe have once been okay are no longer okay. And that goes back to Carol's point about actually legacy issues around what was okay maybe in the 70s or 80s or 90s have changed. And this is particularly so around race, around gender and sexual orientation, and trans rights. So individually, I'd say think about that challenge. Equip yourself with knowledge, because I think what I find very often is that people, once they acquire knowledge and then figure out how to apply that knowledge, they then are able to think about, actually, what do I need to do locally to change that? And that might come by external organizations that you work with or volunteer with. It may come with around institutional faculty or a broader initiative that you can engage with. So for me, the starting point is think about the safety aspect to equip myself, then think about how I stretch myself. So for example, when something inappropriate does come by, and it will at some point, you're then ready and able and exercised to be able to then respond. Because the difficulty is that sometimes these incidents happen and we're not expecting them. And that makes it difficult for us as individuals to respond, because we then in hindsight might have done something differently. So the starting point is equip yourself from the beginning, think about what's safe for you, and then build up your own action plan, because we need everybody to be involved in this. This can't be just left to leaders, because leaders are important, but actually it's what happens on the ground that makes a difference to that whisper bar.
We did have an attendee from Brazil actually suggesting that in future you use something like a Toblerone as an international chocolate example, but the whisper bar, indeed, that bubbles under the surface is very key. Carol, just if I can get a final very quick comment from you on that, how should people get involved in driving that cultural change? What can they do on an individual basis?
Yeah, I think, as Kevin said, understand where your organisation is at all levels, and find out where your agency is. So if you're an undergraduate, you're a customer. If you're a PhD student, you're doing cutting edge research. You have networks that you can connect to outside of your organisation as well. So you have your professional bodies like the Royal Society of Chemistry. You may have friends in other professions. It's always really nice, I think, within academia to step outside and say, actually, what's happening in this company, or how does the health service deal with this, or what's happening in, I don't know, the police who, have had to talk about institutionalized racism. So I think that sanity check is really important. I know friendships are important. Family can be helpful too, because I think one of the real challenges with bullying and harassment is the shame that comes from it and the secrecy. So bringing that out into the open, say sunshine's the best form of disinfectant, and cross-generational can be helpful as well, because that also helps to drive the education of other people with particular lived experiences. And I know some of my, my greatest mentors are my younger colleagues and my students who help me to think about the world in a different way.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Carol. Thank you, Kevin, as well. I think we really have run out of time. To be honest, we've run hugely over, but it's such a fascinating topic and so many great questions from our audience that it seemed a real shame to bring it to a close any earlier than this. With regards to those questions, you've asked so many that we haven't been able to even scratch the surface, but we keep a record of these. We will use these questions to plan future RSC events, future Chemistry World events. We will try and make sure that we tackle some of these questions in the future. So keep an eye on chemistryworld.com/webinars for upcoming events, and rsc.org, where you'll find other upcoming events. But once again, thank you very much, Carol, and thank you, Kevin. Now, a few further resources that you can rely on for your own well-being: the Chemists Community Fund. The links are on screen now for CCF Health and CCF events. The Chemist Community Fund do all sorts of things for chemists across the world, so do have a look there. And if there are things that have been brought up that you're finding very difficult to deal with today, then the details for the Samaritans and Shout are on screen as well, along with the bullying and harassment support line, which we've mentioned a number of times throughout today, but it's on screen now. Make a note of that, or you can visit rsc.li/support, where you can find all of the resources that the RSC has available for you. And speaking of resources the RSC has available for you, next month, next September, and on the next slide, we have the details for the next in this series, in the Building a Better Chemistry Culture series, where we're looking at change, uncertainty, and resilience, how you can develop resilience to uncertainty, how you can tackle and make the most of change. So we'll look at understanding job security, career progression, the uncertainty inherent in that, including, of course, the impact of COVID-19. We'll look at change management, particularly from a leadership perspective, and the psychology behind facing uncertainty and coping mechanisms that you can use to overcome it. So the link on screen now, rsc.li/change and uncertainty. I would put the capitals in there, but I'll try and make sure it works both ways. That you can use to register for next month's event already. That will be at 1:30 on the 17th of September, and we really hope you can join us for that. Should be another really good session as part of this series. Now, before we let you go, we just want to rerun that poll that we did at the beginning so we can see if your understanding of harassment and bullying has improved. So I'm going to run that poll again in just 1 second. So once again, how would you now describe your understanding of bullying and harassment? Is it very good, good, neither good nor poor, poor, or very poor? And that will be on screen just for a minute now. That just gives us an idea of how well this has worked, and I can see already that now half of you feel you have a good understanding, and a great deal of you, 41%, say you have a very good understanding. And I think that's testament to the world-class guests that we have had today. So thank you for joining us. Thank you once again to all of our guests and to the Inclusion and Diversity team of the Royal Society of Chemistry who helped us set all of this up. Do have a look at chemistryworld.com/webinars for upcoming webinars. They're not all about these sorts of topics. There are also technical guides to using equipment, ways to make your own work better, ways to do better experiments and that sort of thing. We like to engage with our community whenever we can. And I think that's all we have. So we will get sent a recording of this webinar in the next few days' time. You will also, everybody who came along for the live broadcast will get a certificate as a way of saying thank you, and we will hopefully see you for the next Chemistry World webinar. I'm Ben Valsler, I'm Chemistry World's digital editor. Huge thank you to Rachel Dance, who's been doing the BSL interpretation throughout today and throughout the rest of the Building a Better Chemistry Culture series. She'll be back with us next month, as will I. So we'll see you again in a month's time for another Chemistry World webinar, where together we can build a better chemistry culture. Thank you.